Tell me that didn't make you want to just get up and dance. Well, maybe not. All right, so YouTube lecture number 4. We're now in period 3, 1754 to 1800. We're going to start with the seeds of the American Revolution. Now, for those of you in my class, you'll note that I will be giving you the key concepts, and you will have them by the time you watch this video. So you're going to need to have the key concepts with you right now so you can go over the ones that we're doing and then take some notes with that. It also ties directly into your video log, because in the video log I ask you what key concepts go along with this. So you're going to want to have that with you. Those of you who aren't in my class watching this, just pay attention to the key concepts, and as I then go over to the examples, try for yourself to think about which of these would be an enrichment or enforcement of the concept that College Board wants us to know. So this is period 3, and we're only going to look at 3.1 for this. But again, it helps us to explain. If you, I'm stumbling over my words. Apologize for that. If you remember, there's a thing called the French-Indian War that's going to take place. After England wins, spoiler alert here, England wins the French-Indian War, England goes bankrupt, and they're going to try to assert the control over the American colonies that they had never done before, where they were practicing salutary neglect. Now they're going to try to enforce their control, which will lead to this independence movement and the Revolutionary War. So staying in 3.1, Roman numeral 1, again, here you see the 7 Years' War, which what's called in Europe. This war was fought in Europe, parts of India, and the Americas. In the Americas, it's called the French and Indian War because the French had allied with American Indians predominantly. England wins, but at great expense, at major costs to them. It says that they are able to expand their territorial holdings. They got all of Canada, the Ohio River Valley, which is what this war is fought over, parts of the Caribbean, but at tremendous expense to them. And when they start to lose a lot of money, now they're going to raise revenue, or the other little evil word that nobody likes, your taxes. And once they begin to raise taxes, that's when things go bad. They also try to stop Americans, here in letter C, from moving westward. And we're going to talk about that both in this PowerPoint and in class, what that was. We're also going to look at Roman numeral 2, how this led to an independence movement. You see, again, the British efforts to collect taxes without that direct colonial representation. No taxation without representation. But as I'll explain to you in school, that's more propaganda than reality. But, you know, here it is in the concept. They want you to know that. As they begin to try to assert their imperial authority over the colonists, that's where they start to get angry over these taxes. Various leaders that emerge. And notice how I love this part B, because part B is a great multiple choice question, because it tells you colonial leaders base their calls for resistance on several things here. Their rights of British subjects, the rights of an individual, local traditions of self-rule. You might remember the House of Burgesses, town meetings in Massachusetts, and the ideas of the Enlightenment. So you can just see a really nice multiple choice question right there. This led to the independence movement. Other leaders, now here they mention by name Benjamin Franklin. Good name to mention, a good person. I like Benjamin Franklin. We'll talk about him in class. I think some others would have fit in a little nicer here, and I'm going to give you one in particular later on. And we see this allowed for multiple Americans to get involved during the independence movement. Also, we start calling this a patriot movement. You get patriots versus loyalists. Loyalists are those who support the English. Americans, by the way, who support the English. Patriots are Americans who support the independence movement. You get large number of them mobilized into various groups, and hopefully you'll see an example you might be able to put in there. We're not really going to do E. E we'll do in class. This is where they actually begin to fight and form an army under George Washington. So we'll look at that later on in class. Let's look at these examples. Now again, using your key concepts, hopefully you have them, and you'll be able to see where some of this examples try to see where these things fit into those key concepts we just looked at. We're only looking at Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2. So again, England loses the French-Indian, I'm sorry, why did I just say it that way? England wins the French-Indian War, but they lose in a sense because of finances, right? And here they now have to start to enforce navigation acts. But I put the Proclamation Act up here with an asterisk because this is not a tax. Remember we talked about, or I showed you, and see which concept this was. They stopped Americans from moving westward. There's a mountain range known as the Appalachian Mountains. They draw this imaginary line and they call it the Proclamation Act. After the war is over, the Indians in the area, they're not ready to become subjects of England. They still would like to trade with the French and maybe any other European powers. They want to have their own self-rule. And so they go to war with England in 1763. It's known as Pontiac's Rebellion. We'll talk more about that in class. England doesn't want to keep fighting the Indians. It costs too much money, too many lives. So they set this proclamation, this imaginary line along the Appalachian Mountains, and they tell the American colonists, you cannot go to Ohio. You cannot go to what will become Tennessee and Kentucky. You can't go there. We're not going to allow you to spread and do migrating into this area. Of course, Americans are going to do it anyways, because that's how America rolls. So that's the Proclamation Act. Enforcing the Navigation Acts, the Sugar Act. We're now actually going to enumerate these products. We're going to make sure that you are carrying what you said you're carrying, sugar, molasses, all of that. This angers Americans, obviously, but they can smuggle. Remember, they can always smuggle, and they will. A quartering act isn't a tax. Again, this is when we're housing soldiers in the Americas. If you don't have barracks large enough to house all the soldiers, you literally have to open up your homes. Americans hate the quartering act so much. This will be part of the Bill of Rights in our Constitution, and I'll show you that, obviously, when we get to the Constitution. Currency Act. Because of these taxes, there's not enough coin in America. So colonies like South Carolina decide to print paper money. And England goes crazy. Whoa, no paper money. No. Coin only. So Currency Act. We're not going to allow the colonies to print paper money. You've got to keep gold coin, silver coin only. But it's this last one. This is the biggie, the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act crisis, the Stamp Act uproar. This is the one that really angers the Americans. This was a tax on all paper products in the colonies. Anything paper. Remember, they live in a paper world. So any paper you needed. You needed a business license. You need a marriage license. You want to buy a newspaper, right? You need to have special documents, whatever. You want to buy stationery and envelopes to literally write letters. You have to buy this stamp. That was a tax. Now, this is not how it looked. This is the Americans mocking it. And you had to buy that stamp before you can buy any paper product. So this was a tax that was a direct tax on them, and the Americans get very, very upset over this. This took away their rights as an Englishman, their rights as British subjects, and this really is what comes this idea of no taxation without representation. You're just putting a tax on us. Internal versus external. I'm going to explain this to you, and if you need to, pause, go back and listen to this again so you understand what I'm talking about. Americans have been internally taxing themselves for years, for decades. That means they were raising their own taxes. Taxes is a part of life that you cannot get away from. And they would take portions of this tax that they raise. Every colony internally taxed itself. They would pay for the royal governor. If you had a royal governor, they would use that tax to pay his salary. If England sent over royal judges to sit on court cases, they would pay the salaries of those judges. Some of that tax also went directly back to England. But a lot of the tax was used for the colonies to support building bridges or building roads and stuff like that. Internal taxes. The colonies tax themselves. An external tax outside the colonies. England had never taxed them directly, ever. The Navigation Acts were not a direct tax. That was a tax that was done out on the seas, right? That's what we call an indirect tax, where the colonists never really see this. It was just a way of controlling trade. Now, the English Parliament has decided to directly tax the American colonies with the Stamp Act. And a tax you cannot smuggle. How are you going to smuggle marriage license? You're going to see some guy in a corner, hey, bud, hey, psst, psst, yeah, you, come here. You look like a guy that wants to get married. You want to get a black market marriage license? What? Right? You're going to go to the underground and get newspapers, and no, that doesn't work. You can't smuggle paper products. And this was a direct tax on them that was external. It was coming from the English Parliament, and that's what makes them go completely angry over everything. They began to resist this, both peacefully and violently. They formed a Congress. The word Congress means law-making body. Well, they had no right to make laws, but they decided to call themselves a Congress. They sent delegates from the various colonies, and they're going to boycott. They come up with these non-importation agreements. One of the key figures here is this guy, Samuel Adams. Not just the guy for the beer. He's the cousin of John Adams. Ordinary Americans are now going to start participating. Think of what key concept that is, where ordinary Americans get involved. They will boycott. They will not buy any British-made product at all. We're not going to buy paper products, but we won't buy your tables. We won't buy your clothing. Women begin to make clothing at home in the various colonies. Men begin to create various cottage industries, that we'll call them, to make their own tables and chairs and desks and things like that. We won't buy any of your products at all. We will hurt you financially. They also begin to protest violently. Organizations like the Sons of Liberty that will burn and destroy British products. They will, what we call, burn in effigy. That means we take somebody and not literally hang them, but make a stuffed like dummy and put their name on it and either hang it or set it on fire. We'll also tar and feather individuals. Tarring and feathering, not a fun thing to do. That's very violent, right? They'll set ships on fire. They'll do everything they can to scare these English officials in America not to prosecute or actually ever put forward the Stamp Act. In fact, both peaceful and violent means worked so well that the following year, England repeals or takes back the Stamp Act. In fact, no stamp was ever actually issued throughout the American colonies, and not one penny was raised in taxes. Although the English Parliament did pass something called the Declaratory Act once they repealed it. This was Parliament declaring its right to bind all the colonies together in all cases whatsoever. They have the right to tax or do whatever they want with the colonies, even though they will repeal this act. And they'll replace it with another act, the Townshend Act, another tax. This was an indirect tax, but it's still external. Indirect in the sense that it was more about trade. The revenue will only come from the trade that happens at the major ports. However, the colonies could no longer internally tax themselves to pay for the salaries of royal governors and judges. Remember, I said that's what they were doing. Under the Townshend Act, they could no longer do that. This indirect tax, because you and I wouldn't have seen it, it was taxes at the ports, so merchants had to pay the taxes. Of course, you do see it in raised prices, right? And it was a tax on tea, lead, paint, and glass. And I think also coffee. They also decided to suspend the New York colonial legislation. They got rid of that. The colonists, though, do not react as passionately over the Townshend Acts because you can smuggle tea, lead, paint, and glass, and coffee. You can smuggle all those things. And in the entire time that the Townshend Act was in place as a tax, I think it's about a 2-year period of time, they only collected about $225 in taxes. That's all they ever collected. However, they did place 2 regiments of British troops in Boston in 1768. And this is a huge moment in history. And this is really a huge catalyst for the American Revolution. Bostonians do not like this. And within 2 years, you get the famous Boston Massacre. I'm going to talk about that in class, so I don't want to take up too much time in the video. But that led directly to death in America. 7 Boston citizens will be shot in the streets during the Boston Massacre. Although we're going to talk about this, and we're also going to show how the Bostonians actually played a role in their own demise in doing this. Well, they will repeal the Townshend Act after the Boston Massacre, but they'll keep the 3-pence toll or tax on tea. Here's now we get local committees of correspondence. Again, think of that. See which key concept this lines up with. Sam Adams, first it's a local thing in Massachusetts, throughout the various towns and cities. Every time something happens, men on horseback will ride from various towns and keep every town aware of what's going on. It also is a good way to spread propaganda as well. Sometimes they would exaggerate what the British were doing just to keep everybody angered and ready to fight. Virginia now gets involved. The Virginians are the one set of allies that the people of Massachusetts will have in this. They want intercolonial committees of correspondence. They want to know what is going on in all the colonies. So you have a series of writers writing through the backwoods who are keeping information flowing. You have a guy on horse, he rides to the next town, he tells everyone what just happened in Rhode Island, for instance. You get the Gaspé incident, where this British ship runs aground off the coast of Rhode Island, and they got stuck. They got too close to land, and they wind up on a sand barge. When the sailors got off to try and get help, people from Rhode Island row out there and set this ship on fire. By the way, that's an act of war. That's why Virginia wants to know, whoa. We don't want colonies starting wars without us. So we want intercolonial committees of correspondence. So a lot of people are now getting involved, making sure that every colony is aware of what's going on. This brought in the resistance movement. This brought in every colony now into play. Some of the southern colonies, as you'll come to see, very loyal to England, not sure they want to get involved. But all these various taxes that are happening, what eventually happens to Massachusetts is going to really unite a lot of the colonies. We're going to get the Boston Tea Party, where they'll destroy a lot of tea in Boston, and England acts very aggressively. The Coercive Acts, or as the Bostonians call them, the Intolerable Acts. And you can see here what they do. This is all aimed at Boston. They close down the port of Boston. They get rid of the entire government of Massachusetts and place a General Thomas Gage as the military commander of all of Massachusetts. They get rid of its Massachusetts charter. They outlaw town meetings. They establish martial law throughout Boston. In fact, it was a law that if 2 or more men were standing on a street corner, that was considered a town meeting and you could be arrested. They enforced a new quartering act where they put soldiers in private homes of individuals. They passed what was called the Administrative Adjustment Act. If a British soldier is accused of a crime, he now went back to England. He could not be tried in America. That relates to the Boston Massacre, which I'll talk about in class. They also passed a Quebec Act. It had nothing to do with Boston, but this angered Americans because it allowed the people of Quebec to keep their French culture, their government, their religion intact, and it allowed Quebec to control all of Ohio. It had really nothing to do with Boston, but you can see where this would really anger the people of America. And all of this now is coming to a head where we're eventually going to get our first shots fired of the American Revolution. These are the seeds of the American Revolution, as you can see. Again, I know I might have went a little quickly because I was trying not to make this thing all that long. For further reading, we can go to our book. We'll talk a lot about this in class. Please use your key concepts, follow along in the video log, and hope you enjoyed it. All right, that's it for me. Have a good evening or a good morning whenever you're watching this.